Welcome back. Okay, first real element of the first unit with the wonderful title, How to Find and Read Research. Yeah, so I trust that most of you say, okay, this is a video I'm gonna skip or fast forward and be my guest, right? It's your video. But I do believe that there's always something to learn in this regard. So let me start with a picture. Everybody younger than 30 most likely has a hard time understanding what this is and what this has to do with looking for literature. But when I wrote my master's thesis, which was a diploma thesis back then in the early or mid 90s, these things were still common in libraries around the world. In German we call this a Zettelkasten, or a Schlagwortkatalog, wonderful German words. It's a catalog. It's a catalog where back in the days, each little card actually was linking a reference to another reference. It was containing a reference, and then there were, Schlagwörter like topics listed on these cards, and then you could sort through these cards by topic and find actually references that relate to a topic out of your interest. I can tell you that this was burdensome and took quite a while. And of course, it also required very diligent librarians to actually work through the literature for us and to identify topics and to identify, let's say, studies or monographs or that actually relate to these topics. So this was very time consuming and demanding, but at the same time it also had advantages. Because the librarians that actually did this were becoming very knowledgeable scholars in their field. So they really understood how literature was connected. And if you were lucky to work with an excellent librarian, then you could actually benefit tremendously from her or his knowledge of the body of literature. Okay, so nowadays, this approach to actually categorizing and structuring research is almost entirely gone, obviously, because we are now lucky. We have all these wonderful online resources that can do connections between studies much faster than any librarian could do. So this is great, and I don't want to cry like a baby about the old times, but I really think that the benefit of having somebody who really has a big grip on the literature and knows a lot about how fields are connected, because doing it like a profession is still extremely useful. So now I want to just briefly talk about 3 different avenues, or maybe just 2 different avenues on how you, as a scholar that tries to get familiar with a new field, in this case now the field on corporate transparency, how you can actually approach your literature research, and then we will do some very simple examples. Okay, so there are many more options that are listed here, and I don't want to go into much detail, but I think I want to highlight 2 because they are also relatively different in how they work. So the first, and I trust that most of you know this, is Google Scholar. So the link you see here, Google Scholar has become almost market dominant as a literature research tool. So it is really great. It's awesome. So you search for terms, you get academic studies, but not only academic studies, and this is the problem. I'm going to talk about this in a second. And then you can link through these academic studies by the references. This is the most important bit of let's say, structured research for studies, because you can follow through time. You will see this in a second, right? So you can follow through time. You can look at studies that cited another study, and you can move from a very important study that is a little bit older to newer studies that actually reference this older study. And by this, you can very efficiently understand the structure of larger groups of research, right? So this is what Google Scholar offers very efficiently, also by actually linking the references throughout papers, and this is extremely helpful. Now, Google Scholar is also extremely good in identifying research on the internet But what it errs in this respect, it errs on the side of including more references. So meaning that some of the studies, actually a lot of the studies that are included in Google Scholar are not really studies in a typical way. So they are maybe slide decks, or they are white papers published by corporations, or they are crazy stuff published by predatory journals, or they anything, right? So in other words, you cannot really trust Google Scholar. Meaning, if you find a reference, a paper on Google Scholar, you cannot really trust per se that this is a piece of academic work. Most of the time, or some of the time it might be, some of the time it's not. And that, of course, is a little bit of a problem, right? So if you are concerned about this, and you should be concerned about this, then you should always balance your literature search with alternative sources. And here I highlight two of them. Both are commercial, and you won't have access. So in order to have access on them, your institution needs to be subscribed to them. So it can be that you don't have access because the institution doesn't have a subscription. So there are two commercial providers, and there might be more. These two I think are currently having a head-to-head about this in terms of quality. There will be Scopus and the Web of Science by Clarivat. So Humboldt, for what it's worth, just recently switched from Web of Science to Scopus. So I will be showing you Scopus in a second. And there might be also alternative providers that I don't list here. So if you happen to have one that you think, hey, these are awesome, and he's not talking about them, please by all means just write them into the comments, right? Okay, so I'm going to show you Scopus, and in order to do so, I will simply click on it. Here we go, and then Scopus should open up. Scopus is a little bit on the slow end, but anyhow. And here you see the interface of Scopus. So it's really rich, I have to say. You can do a lot of good stuff with it. And you see here, this is the little Humboldt logo indicating that I am now, registered with Scopus via my Humboldt account, right? So meaning that you have to have this account. Now let's assume, well, we are in a course on corporate transparency. Why don't we look for corporate transparency, right? Corporate transparency. By the way, it's always awkward to type and read at the same time for me, so don't worry if I mistype or whatever. So now we searched for corporate transparency, and now you see some of the advantages of actually using the Scopus interface. So the first thing that you see is, oops, it will reopen eventually. Here we go. So the first thing that you see is that to the right you find the documents, right? And to the left you find ways on how you can filter these documents. And you see by default the documents are sorted by how new they are, right? So you see here, these are very new publications. Yeah, and you see, when you look at the journals here, so the journals don't really ring a bell with everybody, I guess. Yeah, so, but you already see that there are, some studies that sound interesting, but at the same time, there are a lot of studies, right? So you looked for corporate transparency and you found 3,166 documents. So nobody can expect you to read all these documents, right? So you have to decide what to read. And one way to approach this problem, to say, okay, let's actually sort by these studies that are, the most commonly cited, okay? So let's do this. Okay, so now we have these documents cited by, or sorted by the number of citations. So now what you see here is, first, and you see in the right column, you see that the most influential studies that meet these search terms here, that these studies are cited hundreds of times, so almost thousands of times. And this is the first thing that you observe. Yeah. So there are studies that are much more influential than other studies. And for those of you that are new to this citation analysis field, the citations the distribution of citations are extremely skewed. So the vast body of published studies is not cited a lot. Yeah. So unfortunately. But then there are very few studies that are cited, a real lot, right? So many times over. And sometimes this is even a little bit discomforting because you have this feeling that then they become an automatic cite, so everybody just cites them. This is not really fortunate for the advance of knowledge, but for you as a scholar that is interested in identifying a field, this can actually be relatively helpful. Because if everybody that does work in corporate transparency cites, let's say, a certain paper, then of course it would be easy to find all papers that relate to corporate transparency work because they cite a certain paper. One thing that is problematic in that regard, though, is that different paradigms tend to coordinate on different, let's say, automatic cite references. So for example here, this paper, What Determines Corporate Transparency by Rob Bushman, Joe Piotrowski and Annie Smith, here published in Journal of Accounting Research 2004. It is a very, it used to be a very standard cite in the corporate transparency literature. But only, let's say, in the accounting bubble, if you want. So if you would be a political scientist, most likely you wouldn't be citing that paper. Or if you would be an economist, maybe you wouldn't. That wouldn't be the first paper that you cite, right? So this is something to keep in mind. So when you search for literature by reference, you always risk of staying within a certain bubble of studies, right? So it's always good to combine the citation search with a topical search, yeah. So to play back and forth. And next thing that I want to show you here real quick is you see when you go through the list of journals and compare this with the other list that you've seen. You see that here we have journals, Journal of Accounting Economics, Journal of Accounting Research, Journal of Financial Economics, Journal of Finance, Accounting Review, Strategic Management Journal for what it means. So it's a very good journal, Strategic Management Journal. Okay, so you see that the papers that are cited a lot are predominantly published in relatively few studies. Yeah, so for example here, Journal of Accounting Economics shows up a lot, right? So JFE again. Yeah, so you see that there are certain journals where the discourse on a certain topic is most influential. And understanding these journals can be very helpful for your structured search. So here you now see that there are certain journals that you definitely should have a look at. And for example, in accounting, the leading journals here would be Journal of Accounting Economics, Journal of Accounting Research, the Accounting Review, right? Then in finance, you would have Journal of Financial Economics, the Journal of Finance, and the Review of Financial Studies that is not being listed here. So there are tons of these lists of what constitutes a good journal. And I'm not a big fan of these lists, but when you start to dive into a field, it's always a good idea, I think, to start with influential studies. That you can, in order to get an idea about, what a field covers. So this being said, let's take a look at this one, right? So what determines corporate transparency? As I said, this is a study that actually was quite influential, as you can see, 812 citations. Also, it is a little bit older, so you have to keep in mind that older studies, of course, can be cited more often than younger studies. So there is a when you look for papers that are cited a lot, you will always find older studies, more often. Yeah. So now, what you see here, you see 812 citations. You see the abstract. You can see that here they are really doing work on corporate transparency. They define corporate transparency. This is always helpful, right? So they have a very specific definition here, and then they understand or they try to assess via an empirical analysis what are factors, country level factors that are associated with country levels of corporate transparency, and they link it to governance transparency. That's one factor, and the other factor they call financial transparency. Yeah. And then they say, okay, there is a different country level determinants But you have to think about this as more associative determinants, so that explain how all these aspects of country level regimes are associated. So you see, this is a very, let's say, broad scope study, but it's not a bad idea for a dive into the literature. To focus on these broad studies first. So now to get an idea of how this field has evolved, because we're not really interested in maybe reading as a first study a paper on 2004, although that would be a good paper to read, right? So, but we can do one more step, and this one more step would involve to actually look at all the papers that cite this study. Okay, so here again, so we have another list now. Okay, so this can be confusing, switching from one list to another. So now we have no longer the list that Scopus gave us for corporate transparency as a search term. Now we have a list that actually consists of studies that cite the Bushman-Piotrowski-Smith study, right? So again, it is sorted by whether it's new or not, right? And you see here, several new studies that pop up, but we are interested in focusing on the influential studies first. And in order to do so, we again sort by citation. Okay, and when we cite by citation, now you see, the most influential studies that relate to the Bushman-Piotrowski study, and now you already see newer papers, at least some newer papers, and you also, if you watch the first video, you also see some familiar names. So, for example, here you have Anebaya, right? So this paper, most likely you will also get to know this paper a little bit better. It's a review paper also that reviews the literature published by Anne and co-authors. Very well structured paper, and very influential, as you can see, from 2010, right? Certainly a good read if you want to familiarize yourself with the literature. Then you have here, for example, Christian Lloyd's showing up, right? So this is Burgsteiler High Lloyd's. It has been a very influential study, earnings management in private and public firms. And then you have here a paper on securities regulation, yeah? So also Christian Lloyd's. So you have a more financing paper. Why do countries matter so much for corporate governance? So see, this is a little bit broader paper by Ray Ball. So just from scrolling down this list, you can see, hey, here are a bunch of papers that you should actually take a look at and read. Yeah. So now which one you pick also can depend a little bit on the title, on whether it's new or whether you think that this is really spiking your interest. You can't really do wrong with reading one of these papers here. So, for example, also the top listed paper here is broader than just corporate transparency. So it's a review paper on securities laws. So if you are interested, and of course by world-class scholars in finance, so if you are interested in understanding corporate transparency from the perspective of, let's say, capital markets, then this could be a very good first read to set the stage. Yeah, so to understand what you do. Yeah, so good. So this is what I wanted to show you in terms of how to use these citation tools. You can, in principle, you can do the same thing for Google Scholar. And if we would have a classroom activity now, that would be it, right? So you would do the same thing with Google Scholar and compare the articles that you find. And what you will find is, you will find more articles on Google Scholar, you will find much higher citation numbers on Google Scholar, and you will find much more noise on Google Scholar. And since everybody, all of us are familiar with Google, and I guess most of you are also familiar with Google Scholar, this is why I decided to actually showcase here the Scopus variant. And I do hope that your institution has subscription to either Scopus or World of Science or a competitor, so that you can actually use this for your own advantage. But in essence, if not, then don't feel too bad about it. You can still do with Google Scholar reasonably well, but please keep in mind that you have to verify that the article that you are picking up via Google Scholar is actually published in a meaningful academic journal. So be aware of predatory journals that publish things simply to boost publication numbers of their authors. They publish a lot of very dodgy stuff. And the problem with Google Scholar is that Google Scholar counts so many citations that it even counts the citations within these predatory journal networks. And that means that if you find an article that is published maybe 20 or 30 times, then you cannot really say something about whether this is indicative of the article being reasonable quality. It could still be that this is an article within a low quality network of journals that is basically not helpful. So meaning that when you start to read a field, try to look for those articles that really have impact, a lot of impact, and start with them. Okay, so here you see what I talked about a little bit in a structured slide way. Yeah, so the idea is a little bit that you don't start to collect too many different papers. So don't pile up, right? So there's no point in piling up. Instead, what you should do is you should try and identify one paper that you should actually read. Okay, so and this focus on identifying a paper that you want to read and not collecting papers that you can fill in a reference list. I think this is something that is helpful if you really want to get a grip on the literature. So now let's assume that you found your paper. So how do you read it? So this is of course a little bit meta. Yeah, everybody knows how to read, I hope. Yeah, so most of the audience. But again, you have to think a little bit about, you have to reflect maybe on this, on how you read. And for those of you that are new to reading academic studies, I think it's important to maybe make one or two points here. So the first and maybe most important point is very rarely researchers read papers back to back. Yeah, I'm not saying that this is a good thing, but it's just an observation that it's relatively rare that a scholar would take a paper, sit down in his arm or her armchair and read it from the beginning to the end. And since academics know that, papers have evolved over time into a structure that makes it easy to have this, pick and choose and read approach. So, and you can use this structure to your advantage. And what you have to understand is that basically papers can be, they come in let's say 3 or 4, different stages. So the first stage or the first part is the abstract. Yeah, the abstract is what you've just seen on Scopus. The abstract tries to summarize the main results and the main takeaways from a paper in very few, very precise sentences. So writing a good abstract is extremely important to researchers, and this is why if papers have reached a decent quality, you can expect that they will be, the abstract will be crisp and clean and precise. Okay, so whenever you see a paper that sounds interesting from the title, please read the abstract carefully and think about it for a second. Yeah, so do you understand the abstract? Is the terminology clear to you? If you struggle a lot with the terminology, then maybe it's also time to think about picking up a textbook in order to read a little bit broader about the field, in order to get more familiar with the field and the literature before you actually read academic work. So then, after reading the abstract, you can decide or not whether the paper is worth your time. Yeah, that doesn't mean that the paper is bad otherwise, it's just that maybe the paper is not the right focus for you. So if you decided that the paper is worth your time, then take your time and read the introduction slowly, carefully, and ideally in one go. So the introduction of a paper normally is not longer than 5 or 6 manuscript pages, so it shouldn't take too long to read. And it will normally contain not just an intro teaser, but the main results and what the authors think, how the study actually contributes to the literature. So the introduction should give you the opportunity to get the grip on the paper by just reading these pages. So this is extremely helpful, but it requires you to actually really focus while reading. Yeah, so introductions sometimes read as if they are easy reads, but when you really think about it, they are not, because they are really condensed information. So they provide you a lot of insights, and understanding all these insights is not that easy. So don't read introductions on a bus. Yeah? So if you are new to the field, sit down, concentrate, and read. okay, and really, devote the time. So when you read, you can directly take notes of questions that you have or things that are unclear, terminology that you don't understand. Yeah, and after you read the introduction, these remarks will, let's say, manifest into questions that you have. And normally, what you will do is, as somebody who knows the field a little bit, you will use the reminder of the paper to address these questions. For example, when I read a paper in the introduction, and it's an empirical paper, I often have this time when they talk about the results, they say, I wonder how they do this thing. How they do this specific part of the analysis. And then I will flip through the pages following the introduction and look for the part where they describe exactly that step. The things that are obvious to me, most often I don't really read in the back end because I think, I understand what they're doing there, I understand their approach, and I think that I know how they will do it. But everything where I'm not that sure, I actually, devote more time. And also, I say, this is a surprising result. I wonder how large it is, for example. I will look at the table, the specific table where this result is being discussed, but I don't read the whole back end. So I'm not saying that the whole backend is not worth reading. So I personally enjoy a lot to read a paper from back to time, but it's just time is limited, and so normally we don't really do this a lot. Sometimes when you start to read into a field, you will struggle a lot because you don't understand the method, you don't understand the terminology. Then life is becoming tough as a scholar. And this is why you are taking a course like this one, right? So here in this course, we will try to familiarize you also with the terminology and with the method so that you can then, be an informed reader of the literature and start to do your own work, right? So if you are doing this on your own, then it really requires a lot of, studying, also going back to secondary references, maybe looking for textbooks that give you an introduction to the field. This can be challenging if you're on your own. So it can really be challenging, but please take this problem seriously because you will never do impactful research if you don't know the methods or the terminology of a field well. So it will be extremely hard for you to get hurt. So this means don't just say, okay, I don't exactly know what they're doing, but I can do something similar. This will lead you nowhere. So you have to come over this step. And this is what PhD programs are for and what master programs are for. Okay, so you're at the right place. Good. Now, one thing that I think is extremely helpful, but I have to confess that I don't do it every time, and I should do it more often, is after reading the paper, it's always a good idea to just sit and take some notes. These notes can be just 1, 2, 3 sentences. And normally, I'm an old timer. I tend to print out papers. I have to say, I feel bad about the environment now. But when you do these, after you read the paper, you can simply take notes and try to address the points that are listed here. So, what is the research question? What do they find? Why does it matter? How is the approach that they use? Is there something unique about methods? Do they use a new construct or setting? So when I talk about a setting, by the way, it means the real life empirical environment that they use to collect your data. So if you're in a lab experimental paper, then normally you don't really have a setting. But if most of the work that is empirical, archival, or observational, like people say, they use a setting. They have they look at a certain regulatory reform within the US or something, and taking some notes of this can also be really, really helpful. Okay, then you also see what the main findings are. Apologies for the typo. And which questions you have after reading the paper. All this, I think, is really helpful to structure your mind, to clear your mind about the paper, and then also to summarize a little bit what you learned. And then the problem is when you pick up the paper a year later, and it will happen, then you've almost forgot that you read it. But when you see that you have notes, so be it on the whatever, the PDF, or be it on the printout, you see, this is what I thought when I read the paper, and this can be extremely helpful, believe me. Okay, so now, of course, I know all this video sounds extremely patronizing, and maybe you're already thinking, well, maybe it was not a good idea to enroll in this course. But I really think that over the long run, what distinguishes good academics is that they are well read. I have yet to meet somebody who has developed a real serious impact on the field that is not a well-read person. So it means don't think bad when you read. You should never think bad about you as a scholar when you spend time reading. There are always this time in PhD programs where other students will, yeah, I'm already working on this project, and I'm already doing this, and I'm already doing this, and while you are still reading the literature and think, wow, I'm only reading. So here's my advice that I heard from a good friend. Don't worry, you will write your first good paper soon enough. Yeah, but if you don't spend time reading early in your career, it will come back to haunt you at some point. It is, if once you are busy in the tenure blah 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 world, then you will read a lot still, but you don't decide what to read. You read things that are submitted. You read things that you will be invited to review and so on, and you will read PhD theses and master theses. Okay, good. Last point. It can be extremely helpful to talk about papers with others, and ideally you can do this in a journal club or a reading group in your department or with your fellow student colleagues. If there is such an opportunity, do it. It might feel a little bit awkward in the beginning to say, okay, let's talk about this paper, but it really helps you to express your thoughts about a paper, to develop your academic language, and to be able to reflect on how other people read the literature. So it is extremely helpful. If you are in a PhD program that doesn't have a reading club, do one, right? Yeah, so you can do this on your own. You don't have to have a supervisor supervising you when you talk about research. No need. Okay, perfect. So thanks for suffering through this video. The next video will be even more hands-on, I promise. And until then, take a break or, just continue watching. It's up to you. Okay, cheers. Thanks.